So I am guessing that you have felt the weight of this week as I have. The largest mass shooting in our history. 59 people dead, 500 or more wounded, bullets crashing into a crowd that was gathered at a concert for 10 minutes, bullets careening into the crowd, people dodging and crawling and shielding each other as people were being hit. And always we're left with the question of why? What is it that would cause someone to gather 23 guns and I don't know how many rounds of ammunition, enough that he had an extra 1,600 in his car, plus plus the materials to make 50 pounds worth of explosives? What would move someone to do this? The questions of why. What is it inside this man that led him to this point to rent a room so that with two different angles and handwritten calculations of how to get bullets into the crowd in the most effective and deadly way? What is it that caused this? I'm guessing that you've been feeling this weight too, especially since it comes on the heels of so much other heavy stuff. Hurricane damage in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean. Nuclear-tinged tensions with North Korea. The white supremacists showed up again in Charlottesville last night, marching with their torches yet again. Earthquakes in Mexico, so many people dying, so much heavy stuff that we carry. I'm guessing that you're feeling the weight of it too. Honestly, as this week, as I read that another hurricane has come, Hurricane Nate, and it was going to make, when I read that it was making landfall as only a Category 1, I thought, underachiever. But seriously, 85 mile per hour wind plus an 11-foot storm surge in flooding, that's not nothing. It's just that it's been appealing in comparison to all the weight that we're carrying. I'm guessing you've been feeling this too. And so together we come with the same questions. Every time we face hard news, we're left with the same question. Whether it's something in the news, in our newspaper, or it's something that has happened in our lives, whether a devastating diagnosis or a pink slip or someone breaking a relationship, whatever it is, we're left with the same question, aren't we? Is God here or not? Is God an absentee landlord? Did he just wind things up and started going and then left us on our own? Is God here with us, or are we left to our own devices? These are the questions that we ask every time because they are the right and most ordinary questions to be asking. And so we come together. When things are heavy and things are difficult, we come together to try to look for an answer, and we come together to look to the words of Jesus for some help. Is God an absentee landlord or not? And man, today's words from Jesus don't look like they give us much help, do they? At first glance, this story about, it just sounds like another cycle of violence, and we face that too much anyway. We've got an absentee landlord and farmers that are beating people up and killing an heir, and we're left at the end of it just waiting for the soldiers to come marching in, waiting for the landlord to just wipe out the farmers and start over again. This doesn't feel like good news, does it? Or that it's going to help us answer our question. In fact, it looks at first glance like it's saying the opposite of what we want to hear. And at second glance, and at third glance. Until we look a little bit closer, we notice there is one thing in this gospel parable that's a little odd. It's a little different than what we would expect. There's something weird about this landlord. We can hold on to that because there's something off here. So the context is that Jesus has occupied the temple in Jerusalem. He has come marching into town on a donkey. He has gone directly into the temple where he has taken over operations here. And those who have been tasked with tending to worship there in the temple need to know, what are you doing? He's challenging their authority to make sure worship happens in the right way. And so they need to know, by what authority are you doing this? And in response, Jesus tells stories. And here's one of the stories that he tells. There was a landowner. And already, right now, even at the beginning of this parable, we ought to pay attention to the fact that the subject of the parable is the landowner, not the tenants. There was a landowner who bought a vineyard. And look at how much work this landowner puts into it. He does everything that the vineyard needs to thrive. Plants the vines, tends them, digs around. He puts in a big tower fence around the outside, digs a wine press, tends to it, and gives to this vineyard everything it needs to thrive. And then rents it, leases it to sharecroppers. Notice, though, those sharecroppers could never have done that kind of investment into this vineyard, but the landowner has given them everything they need. And vines, when you plant them, what I read this week is that it takes like 3 to 5 years before you get really any kind of harvest. So they've been living in this vineyard, as meanwhile the landowner has gone away. Now, 3 to 5 years later, the landowner sends people who work for him to collect his rent, a portion of the harvest. But something has happened, hasn't it? Those farmers, the vine dressers, the folks who were living there, the sharecroppers, they kind of forgot whose vineyard it is. It's an ordinary human thing. We equate effort with ownership. And for us, in our day, we see that most clearly in the way that we relate and think about those little green rectangles that are in our wallets. Those represent for us our toil, our efforts, our strength, and our sweat that we put in. Those are a mark of our hard work, and we forget that whose they really are and what they really are. We easily fall into the trap of thinking that effort equals ownership, that is ours, and if you don't agree with me or believe that that's true, toss your wallet up here now. It's awfully easy for us to forget whose world this is, isn't it? I do. I'll bet you do too. And for these sharecroppers, 3 to 5 years living in this, they forgot whose vineyard it is. They forgot who bought it and invested in it and put in everything that they need, providing for them. And just like us, when someone shows up to ask for something that we think is ours, that our effort and energy was sunk into, they resent it. Now, they take it to extremes. I hope that, we don't follow this particular pattern because they rough up the servants, they beat them, they kill them, and then they throw rocks at them until they're dead. So it's an exaggerated story, we hope. The landowner sends another group, more of them, as though maybe if there are more people, more support, the tenants will listen. But no, same thing. They rough them up, beat them up, kill them, and stone them. Now, we know how this works, don't we? We know what comes next because we know what the cycle is. This is what happens in the cycle of violence, is that the soldiers come next. The landowner has had his property stolen, his people beaten, he's been disrespected and insulted, and that cannot stand. Next is you call the police, you send in the SWAT team, you bring in the soldiers with their guns and their swords and their marching boots, and you wipe out those farmers and you start over. We know how this works, don't we? Because we have seen this. This is how the world works. But there's something odd about this landowner. There's something odd about this vineyard owner. Because shockingly, he starts to talk to himself. And he says to himself, they're not listening. I'll send my son, my heir, my treasure. They'll listen to him. We know how this is supposed to go, but the landowner chooses to set his anger away. He chooses vulnerability in the face of violence. He chooses mercy instead of retribution. He chooses grace instead of pursuing what is his right. It is shocking what this landowner does. It's not supposed to work this way. This kind of vulnerability, this is not the way the world works. And that, dear friends, is the cornerstone that our world stumbles over all the time, isn't it? Because Jesus is the one that God sent into his vineyard, choosing the vulnerability of being human, born as a baby, of choosing grace and mercy and forgiveness just because. This is not how the world works, and so it trips over this all the time. What do you mean? There's nothing I can do to look better in God's eyes. And what do you mean that I need to ask forgiveness? Our world trips over this because we expect that the world works like a marketplace, that people are only as valued as they are a commodity to my comfort level. And Jesus says no. Says you are dear enough to be loved by heaven just because you are a child of God and you have inherited forever just because. And there is not a thing you can do about it. But Jesus is the Son that God sends into his vineyard because God's way is different than the world works. And the world stumbles over it. We stumble over it all the time. So what is the good news that we need to hear this morning? Just this. It ain't our vineyard. Right? Not a one of us was responsible for that sun coming up this morning. Not a one of us was responsible for the air that we breathe. Not a one of us set up the rules of physics that give us things like lights and cars that can get us where we need to go. Not a one of us caused that breeze out there or the rain that came yesterday. Not a one of us, in fact, had anything to do with being born into the world. Not a single one of us. It's not our vineyard. This is God's world. And he's leased it to us to care for it. We're the tenants who care for God's vineyard. And that is good news because God sent his Son into the middle of the vineyard as a baby. choosing helplessness, choosing to be a servant of others, choosing grace and forgiveness, choosing the heart of God, which is mercy with justice. It's God's vineyard. And that is good news. So here's your challenge for the week. For this week, as you go about your day in the midst of this world that forgets whose world it is, here's your challenge. Every time you go to the store and you pull out your credit card or you pull out your wallet and you pull out some of those little green rectangles that we get so bent out of shape about, I want you to mutter to yourself, "It's not my vineyard." Okay? It's a little reminder of whose world and whose stuff that is that's been entrusted to us. So I have this vision that, 200 of us or so are going to go out and we're going to spend a week, and all of Valparaiso and further abroad are going to have people saying, "It's not my," muttering as they're going up to the checkers, okay? Come back and tell me next week what that was like for you. To be reminded every time you pull out your wallet, it's not my vineyard. And let's see what that does to us, to be reminded this is God's vineyard, okay? So that's your challenge. Every time you pull out your credit card, every time you make a purchase, if it's online or it's at the counter, it's not my vineyard. And then come back and let's share next week.